Retired Australian Army Major Cameron Leckie returns for another episode of Bogan Intelligentsia. Today, Cameron joins us to talk about the recent US Generals meeting, where Secretary of War Pete Hegseth addressed the entire US brass to direct them on things like future personal training standards, appearance, and the end of rules of engagement. Cameron speaks about how this meeting and its messaging may affect Australian troops that are linked to the US security umbrella. Cameron also will speak about multipolarism and how the US seems intent on combating it around the globe. Stay tuned for a riveting conversation. Thank you for returning to Bogan Intelligentsia, Cameron Leckie. How are you today?
I'm very good, Joel. Thanks for inviting me back. Good to chat again.
Yeah, thanks. And look, there's plenty going on right now. We would love to potentially talk about it all, but I think it might be good to start off with what happened over in Quantico, Virginia, where Pete Hegseth essentially rounded up every single admiral and general in the United States and put them under a roof and told them they sort of had to shape up or ship out, which seemed to be the theme of the meeting. Essentially, Hegseth telling the generals they have to pass PT tests and have appearances looking a certain way. Can you tell us a little bit more about what might have happened there?
Well, I think we need to put it in the context of where things are heading in the United States, and it doesn't take a genius to work out nowhere real well. Things aren't tracking real well. So much of what we see is theatrics, and I think much of this was theatrical. From what I understand, it's the first time that's ever been done. And so I guess from that perspective, it's significant, and that sort of adds to the spectacle. And I guess we only see what was broadcast as well, which very fact it was broadcast was also interesting and just adds to the theatrics. I know in the Australian Army, I'm not sure how often, if they still do it, but they used to have a General's Day fairly regularly where all the senior officers would get together for a day or thereabouts and chat about stuff. And, being a junior officer, you don't really get invited to those sort of things, but it was never seen as it wasn't a theatrical event. It was a part of, normal business. But what you didn't see was it broadcast worldwide and the contents of it. So quite a different approach. I think it's largely theatrics, and there's some quite interesting and some quite concerning commentary in it. I think one of the things that I found most concerning, particularly from the Australian perspective and for the Australian Defence Force, and more importantly, members of the Australian Defence Force, was the talk about the laws of armed conflict and rules of engagement.
Yes.
That was pretty scary. I mean, maybe it's just being honest, because if you only have to look what's happening in Venezuela and Iran and elsewhere this year, and it's just two examples where I think in Yemen as well, where the United States has clearly violated laws of armed conflict, and that they have no real restraints on their rules of engagement compared to a normal country does. So it's pretty scary when they talk about language like that. But to be honest, it's a bit like renaming the Department of Defence to Department of War. It's more honest than the previous name. So it's just calling a spade from that perspective. But the thing that concerns me, and I saw on Twitter another retired Australian Army officer, Ray Martin, spoke about this as well, is what it means for the Australian Defence Force personnel. So if we, I'm sure it hasn't changed since I left the Army, I certainly hope not, that the Australian members of the Australian Defence Force are tied by rules, regulations, laws, and part of them are aligned to the laws of armed conflict, and we have them for a reason. It's because war is barbarous enough as it is without having no restraints on it. And our Australian soldiers, as they were treated by the Japanese during World War II, is an example of why we want those rules of engagement and laws of armed conflict, because if we have troops taken prisoner, we'd like them to be treated appropriately. So when you take all the gloves off, you'd expect that the other side, your enemy, may also take the gloves off. So we try to keep a lid on that barbarism, and that's what they're basically talking about when they're saying let's get rid of these rules of engagement. And the other thing is, this is troubling on multiple levels. So it's not just that we're working with the military, it's like that. We're also putting Australian Defence Force personnel in a position. You imagine if you're an Australian working with the United States, um, and the United States does something that violates the laws of armed conflict. Well, that's a pretty terrible position for an Australian Defence Force member to be put in, because they're now complicit in a war crime, potential war crime. And as we've seen with David McBride's case, when you put your hand up and say, no, there's something wrong here, you really haven't got a leg to stand on. So even though Nuremberg trial said I was just following orders, there's no defence, that's not much. It doesn't give you much comfort knowing that way that the Australian government will prosecute you if you stand up and put your hand up and say something's not right. So it puts Australian Defence Force people in pretty ordinary circumstances, and given the way our government seems to be quite keen over the decades to get involved in every military misadventure the United States gets involved in, it's really quite sobering and concerning for members of the Australian Defence Force.
To hear you say it from the perspective of a service person, potentially what this does to put Australians or anyone involved in that American security umbrella at risk by reneging on rules of engagement, how that's all not only just a irresponsibility from American decision makers on their own troops, but on their broader alliance and the troops within that broader alliance. And yeah, just thinking of it like that, yeah, if we want to forego rules of engagement, then the same applies on the other side. And we're seeing those complications happening in Ukraine, for example, as rules of engagement have evolved or devolved over the course of that conflict there. So this FAFO we keep hearing everywhere, I think it's one of the most destructive terms that's come out of the meme space. This F around find out scenario, the Hegseth spoke to the generals as, essentially the US military doctrine moving forward. How does that impact on the independent professionality of the ADF, which is always acting in tandem or unison with America? And we also hear Miles talking about interoperability being such a key aspect of Australia's strategic future. So where does that leave Australian troops if we do have a belligerent kind of military class in Washington looking for a new world order as far as the rules are concerned?
When I know if you read any of the history of Australian service people or soldiers and that in the Vietnam War as an example, they're pretty disparaging of the United States military as far as their competence and the discipline and training levels of their soldiers. And I guess even when I joined, we still had still used to joke about American soldier could just do one thing. If it was the left-hand wheel of a vehicle they could change, that's all they could do. So we used to still joke about that. But I think over time, when we see it at multiple levels, and I guess I'm 5 or 6 years removed now, but I think over time, we've sort of lost that bit of separation and in between the United States and us. And I think that's probably been a deliberate strategy in some ways through exchanges and the military operations we've been on, and certainly at a political level, because it's been politically expedient to, always doubling down with the United States. So I think we've probably had to change culture now, that we probably don't question the United States as much as what we once did, or recognise, just they're they're not as good as what they say they are. Yeah, I know, but it's a bit hard when you're removed from that. But I guess the other side of it is too, is you only have to think, look what what's happening with Ukraine, the bases around the Pacific, and the United States, I don't think is very keen to fight a major war with Russia or with China. Iran might be a different story, but what they are willing to do is push their allies forward to bear the brunt of it. So that's where that's the real risk, is that we'll be manipulated into manipulated, forced is probably blackmailed, those sort of terms, is into a conflict which is not in our interest, just as fighting Russia is not in Ukraine's interest. We cannot win, just as Ukraine can't win against Russia, and had no good outcomes. And that's, I think, the real concern, is where we've been suckered in, and now we're so far in, it's very hard to extract ourselves. And I really think we've put ourselves in a lose-lose situation, because there's no real good outcome, and I've said it several times before, is we're going to take a hit some way, shape, or form as a result of our alliance with the United States. How and what that looks like, well,
Mm.
you can't crystal ball that, but we're going to take a hit at some stage. Um, and rather than acknowledge that and start to think about some ways we can ease out of that, minimize that risk and damage, we seem to be just going ever further deeper into that relationship, which is going to do us enormous harm in, you know, the not too distant future, medium term future. Like it's going to happen. I'm pretty well certain of that.
Like even comparing it with Ukraine there, Cameron, on the eve of the Ukraine SMO, I think Ukraine had, correct me if I'm wrong, the biggest or the most powerful modern army in Europe, essentially, that they developed over since 2014. So they had nearly a decade of building up this military capability. They have a history of fighting, of being a martial group of people, and the differences compared with Asia right now, and trying to shore up a coalition of like pro-US Asian like-minded thinkers is going to be a lot more difficult just on the surface. I mean, Australia's population alone, and being able to muster up a willing spearhead force on behalf of the US, combined with potentially what the Philippines, and we're outliers already. I mean, you're seeing the Eastern Asian nations who have very complicated relationships with the US, like Korea and Japan, starting to break off into their own sovereign sort of trajectory. And Australia is playing this game of musical chairs with the Philippines, who really is a Marcos election away from turning back into a pragmatic regional partner again. That leaves Australia kind of on its own. And I just sort of want to ask, like, how could the Washington even be like considering a Ukraine-style coalition against China in Asia?
Yeah, well, it's almost partial when you think about it. Like, there's an article came out from one of the leaders within, I can't remember her position, but one of the senior people within the Australian Strategic Policy Institute the other day, which is just a word salad, which, the coalition of the willing type terms, and how we basically need to subordinate ourselves to the United States and be able to act within hours to respond to, for deterrence purposes and stuff like that. And I mean, if you just take it on face value, just sort of highlighted there, who in our region is interested in taking on China or being involved in a conflict with China? No one. And so it's like it should be treated as partial because I mean we can't, like what are we gonna do? Like other than embarrass ourselves.
Toothpicks
Um,
at mountains.
yeah, that's right. So there's nothing of any significance that we could do. It's not going to come back 100 times at us. ASEAN, there's no country, even the Philippines and that, they have the argy bargy, which I think is just most of that's at the US bidding, just as most of our provocations with regards to China at the US bidding, such as when we sail through the Taiwan Strait. Um, that that doesn't actually solve any issues other than raise the tension. And so there's no one in ASEAN, and ASEAN's whole approach, as Kishore Mahbubani talks about, like that patience. They have lots of disagreements, but they're pragmatic. So they agree on what they can agree on, and then they slowly but surely move to address the issues that are more intractable. So they're not interested. And then you think, who's China linked with? Or North Korea, Russia. Um, China and India, I think they've both seen the light that they need to improve their relationships. And and this is where the sort of counterproductive nature of the United States approach to the world, like, India now sees, well, all these tariffs and threats of tariffs and telling us to stop buying Russian oil, etc., which will just sink our economy. Like, so there's no one in our region, although New Zealand seems to be, on the same trajectory as we are, but I'm sure the might of New Zealand and Australia is not really something that the military planners in the PLA are too concerned about. So it's quite farcical, yet we're whipping ourselves up into, or certain segments of our society are whipping ourselves up into a frenzy about the most daunting strategic circumstances we've ever faced. Well, you look in our region, and there's no other countries other than the few Anglo outposts that see it that way. So it's we should be laughing at ourselves about how foolish we are, but we have people who paid good money to whip up this fear and try and instill the need to turn ourselves into a military economy just so we can fight off a threat which is only in existence because our United States brethren want it to be that way.
The farcicality that you mentioned is really where it's at. And I mean, really what it's done is just create a bigger cleavage between those who kind of press on with this narrative and just the everyday punters that don't need to be military experts that are just going, what the hell's going on here? We're seeing.
I take my wife as a bellwether as that, because she doesn't follow politics or geopolitics at all, but even she, without my prompting, can see that. So I think, the ordinary person on the street, more often than not, can see through some of this BS. And I think some of the commentaries coming out, it's becoming increasingly. I wrote an article a couple of years ago called "Loss of Empire, Loss of Lucidity," and I think that's what's happening as the US empire implodes. The people who are true believers in it and have staked their entire career and their reputation and their financial security on it, they're getting into a panic. And I think as a result, we're seeing some really quite silly commentary, which I
Incredible.
think it's a phase. Hopefully we'll move through that phase, but if that phase doesn't end before we get into a conflict, well, we're in big trouble.
Look, I mean, we're seeing in the US the same failed architects of the Iraq War rebranding themselves as the saviors or the architects of Gaza or whatever. It's incredible. So I wouldn't put it past these people. So that brings me back to the farcicality of the US and its allies trying to prosecute some of these new ideas versus what's going on around us. We saw that military parade there in China for the 80th anniversary of World War II. It was quite an incredible moment, really, and outside of the West was recorded as such. But we had, apart from Dan Andrews and Bob Carr, we had pretty much every world leader outside of the collective West there to pay tribute to China's efforts in World War II as they're trying to reclaim narratives about their history in that war and also to project their future and their strength. That military parade blew people's minds away. And there's still people in the US now that are reeling after some of the technologies on display there. And the words that Xi delivered about, really was peace through strength. We're hearing Trump talking about, I don't know, war is peace. But Xi was talking about a concept of peace through strength and its idea of never again expanded to a more global vision. And we're contrasting this with almost a reactive event there at Quantico with Hegseth. So I just want to ask you, did you feel, how did you feel that this sort of contrasts the professionality of China versus the reactivity of America?
Well, it's chalk and cheese. I mean, yes, you can say the parade, it was also theatrical to an extent. But, it was precision. It was, discipline, organization. And, it's more like pageantry, I suppose, than theatrics. And then you compare it to the, was it 200 or 250th birthday parade that the US Army had with Trump, and
With the Kid Rock tracks in the background. Oh my God.
yeah, it's like so it is chalk and cheese. But I guess this is the key difference is that the Western world, led by the United States, is in decline, and the Eastern world, and with China as one of its leaders, uh, is on the rise. And I think in that context, everything makes sense. So the United States is scrambling to try and it's it's like everyone has an opinion, but when I look at Trump and his administration, I think they know the United States is in trouble, but their approach to trying to deal with it is maladaptive. And so this is why we have theatrics. And I read somebody said a good thing the other day is like, I think it was Arnold Bertrand on Twitter, that China in the West we create a narrative and then try to get force things to align with the narrative we've created, whereas China just does stuff and then that creates the narrative. And in a world where reality bats last, which as far as I can tell is the world we live in, which approach is going to be effective. Like, it's like you can't. It, you need the building blocks in place. You need to be able to do something, and then the narrative sells itself. Whereas when you're trying to sell the narrative through spin and a relentless PR media campaign, information operations, all that, well, that will work for a while, but you can't keep it up indefinitely. And I think that's where we're finding ourselves now, is that we have one country which just goes like, look at renewable energy. I thought it was, I read something the other day that China actually installed three times the renewable capacity Australia's ever installed last year in 12 months. Um, so, that's actual things happening. So that's creating a narrative as like, obviously they still got a big dependency on fossil fuels and that as we do. But for a country to be able to install three times as much renewable energy power in 1 year, or capacity in 1 year, as what we have in, I guess 20 odd years, or however long it's been, we've been on that path. Like, that's facts on the ground. That's hard to argue with, compared to the theatre of getting all your generals in and giving them a rah-rah talk and, chest beating and alpha male and all that sort of stuff. When, in the 12-day missile barrage between Iran and Israel a couple of months ago, they almost ran out of missiles, which is why it really stopped. So, you can create narratives, but it has to be backed up by reality. And when they diverge too much, reality always comes back to bite you. Whereas China, they just go about their business, and the proof is in the pudding. And that's, I think, it can't be any more stark than that. Is one. So the Eastern world is, developing, doing things. The Western world is struggling to work out how it adapts to a world that it's no longer dominant in. And rather than just, I don't see any reason why the West and East can't coexist. We can all benefit. But because we can't come to terms with that, we see all the theatrics, which, basically any major event we're involved in the Western world, it's largely theatrics. And, there might be some bloodshed and bombs and missiles thrown in at weak countries, or that they can't really defend themselves. But, largely it's theatrics.
Hmm. So, from theatrics to potentially supporting or enabling Washington's theatrics, we're hearing about a new base, or basing rights, or access to a base for the United States in Queensland for a new helicopter initiative. Would you be able to firstly explain a little bit about what's going there, following on what you're talking about, how much of this is about pageantry, how much of it is about establishing a hardwired presence in the region, and how much of it, is about threats or acquiescing to Washington's, sporadic instructions?
Yeah, well, I don't think we've seen anything from the Australian government announcing this. I think it came from the US, and it's sort of rumor. Um, looking at several perspectives. First of all, why are they putting? Uh, sorry, the Army Aviation Base at Oakey, which I've been to, and I'm sure it's no secret, is our helicopter school, basically. So that's where all our pilots, maintainers, technicians, etc., get trained on how to fly a helicopter and how to maintain a helicopter. It's already got a foreign military component there, being Singapore. They have some aircraft there. And so I guess from that perspective, you can look at it and say, oh, it's not, particularly necessarily a big story. But once again, it's another base on Australian soil. And why are they putting them there? Well, there's increasing commentary that basically the US realizes that it's, the first island chain, it's extremely vulnerable in. And so you could look at it from that perspective as, is this a withdrawal? Is this part of the withdrawal from that first island chain? Because they know that anything based in that is going to be highly vulnerable if and when conflict with China comes. So it could be, you could look at it from that perspective, which, what does that mean? Well, that means that we're the next island chain, so to speak, so that if there is a conflict, it's just another US military capability that's on Australian soil. And then you can look at it from well, is it there for the defence of Australia or Australia's national interests? And I don't think you can answer that as a yes. That's there for the US interest, as are all their military capabilities based in Australia. So it's there for their interests, which sort of says, well, if the United States manages to trigger a war with China, and I mean, it's unlikely that highly unlikely they'll be able to project force from that particular base, but there are other um, facilities in Australia, such as the B-52s that'll be at Tyndall, and I think RAF Tyndall and RAF Darwin. They've used aerial refueling to bomb Yemen through Cairns Airport, as the Nautilus Institute report has highlighted. So there are other bases from which they can actually project force against China. And China has the capacity to hit back. What we don't have the capacity to do is defend ourselves against the sort of missile systems, ballistic missiles that might come our way. So we put ourselves in a position where we now have targets against which we have no defence, because Australia's air defence capability is a bit of a joke, particularly against these sort of missile systems. Like the Army effectively has nothing of any use against these systems. The Air Force got their fighter jets and that, but they're not really designed to shoot down ballistic missiles and things
Let
like
alone
that.
hypersonic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So we have no defence now. I mean, we're not going to be. I wouldn't imagine if there was a conflict that there'd be dozens and dozens or hundreds of missiles fired at Australia. But any of the force projection capabilities in a serious conflict could well be targeted, and that could include our ports and airfields, which would have major, significant damage to Australia, our economy, and all for what. And I guess then you look at it from the sovereignty perspective. So the AUKUS really is all about, the submarines are a bit of a smokescreen for what it really is about, and that's about US basing rights in Australia. And that was the way for that was paved with the Force Posture Agreement. And I think IPAN, the Independent Peaceful Australian Networks, actually got a list, which I don't have off the top of my head, of agreed facilities where basically the US can do what it wants in those facilities, as much as movement of weapons and access. And so we've handed our sovereignty there. And so I would assume that if we're putting another US military base in at Oki, that would be one of these another bases which has that capacity the US to basically do what we want. So we've handed over our sovereignty, to fight a conflict we can't win, for a conflict which there's no good outcome for us. So it really makes you question the rationale of why we're doing these things.
Yeah, and I can recall at a Senate inquiry a couple of years ago, Penny Wong neither confirming nor denying US nuclear ordnance at Tyndall. I mean, I don't know if it's finished construction yet, but there was scope to be a large bunker facility built there with no keys, no spare keys given to the Australians at all. And what you mentioned here is more of this, right? More of these sort of black or grey stockpiles of weapons or munitions that we don't really know their capability or what they're doing in the country. Are you worried about things like this? Is this one of the big considerations as well of making us a target too, knowing that there might be a stockpile hidden in an Australian base? Or
Well, yeah. So there's only one country in the world that's used nuclear weapons, obviously, and that's the United States. Uh, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, if I presume you've listened to him speak, and he's quite concerned that as the United States goes downhill, it will use nuclear weapons again. Now, if you're the United States and you want to use nuclear weapons as an example against China, where would you fire them from? Would you fire them from the mainland United States, or would you use another third party, expendable third party, to fire them from?
yeah, and there's not enough surface area on Guam alone, so they're going to need a couple more. That's right.
Yeah, so that's right. And if nuclear weapons were fired at China, well, China doesn't have an enormous nuclear arsenal. I do believe it's getting bigger, but we could find that coming our way, and a nuclear weapon in a couple of our key cities, and Australia. Like you imagine the impact. And I mean, once one nuclear weapon's fired, it's probably all over. I mean, I don't think they'd be able to stop the escalation and just be tit for tat until it's global nuclear conflagration, and it's all over. Come back and see the cockroaches evolve into something in a million years or something like that. So that's the sort of thing we're risking, and it's just and like that's an extreme event, and that's an extreme event that we just turning a blind eye. Just um, you don't tell, we don't ask. Like it's inexplicable how a sovereign government can be so blasé about something which is actually an existential risk for our country. I don't know. Can you explain it? I certainly can't.
Oh, and with all these Jack D. Ripper moments happening in Washington, where you've just got all these like unhinged comments coming out of everyone, from the top brass talking about, preeminent war. I forget who that strategic commander was that was talking about imminent war with China within the next, 3 years or something like that. You've got Hegseth talking about just lids off, FAFO, rules of engagement. You got JD Vance joking about fishermen maybe needing to avoid the area around Venezuela. The gloves are off, and we're seeing this like belligerent, disruptive force in a country that is destroying the checks and balances and the rules that are helped to create. I kind of want to ask you here. You're mentioning that clearly within Canberra, potentially within the noggin of Miles himself, there might be some doubts about the future of this relationship and our ability to keep some kind of sovereign integrity if things go wrong. So how can Australia continue to develop this sovereign temperance to best place itself, to potentially set up a parallel or an independent hedge on the side of this all eggs in the US basket? Is it possible? And essentially, how do we hedge our reliance on Washington?
Yeah, that's the multi-million, possibly multi-billion-dollar question, really. How do we do this? So when the US empire was at its peak, and being a sub-imperial power, like we got some benefit out of that, and we had to pay the down fees, such as the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, war in Vietnam, etc. But on the whole, I guess we benefited from that in we didn't have to spend as much on defence, and we punched above our weight because we were, deputy sheriff and things like that. Now, on the downside of that empire's trajectory, that's reversed. So the countries on the outside, the outer, they suffered as a result of being on the outer side of empire, as the US empire as it was on the way up. Now that's reversed. So the countries on the outside of the US imperial system are actually in a better position now to deal with the decline of the US than what countries like Australia are. So I guess that's the context. And I mean, if I was king for a day, well, actually I wouldn't be king because I'd like us to be a republic, but that's another story. If I was, say, president for the day, it'd be clean cut. We've got the forced posture agreement, 12 months. Say, thanks, United States. We don't need you to defend us anymore. Off you go. Thanks very much. See you. Good luck, and we'll meet the UN, have a chat about things there. But that's not the world we live in. So we need to be sensible about it. And I guess my quiet hope is, um, that as long as we avoid getting into the next big war, things will, sort of naturally. I mean, because there's growing skepticism. I mean, I've been writing about the decline of the US. I think the first thing I had published in the Australian Defence Force Journal mentioned that in like 2012 and that. So there wasn't many people talking about it then. But there's lots of people concerned about the United States and our relationship with it now. So so that's a good thing. But if we can that skepticism, so the people who the ASPI pushers, etc., the empire evangelists who are full on for the US empire, they're marginalising themselves. Like the longer they try to headbutt the brick wall, trying to sell the argument we need to be all the way with the United States, like events are proving them to be in my view, foolish. So if we can avoid that big war, I think, maybe naturally things will just fall. They'll self-organize without too much heartache. But if the pressure and this, that's probably our best case scenario is that the US empire keeps blundering along, and over time its influence and power just gets less and less, whilst the alternate, the world reorganizes itself around that, and Australia doesn't have too much to worry. The alternative, of course, is that we get involved in a conflict, through. And that's what worries me, is that I can't see any of our political class having the nous, the strength, the vision to say no to the United States when the pressure gets put on us. So that's the worst case scenario. In which case we're talking about an entirely different scenario if we do get involved in a conflict, because unlike Iraq, unlike Afghanistan, where unless you're involved, you had a family member involved, it really didn't impact upon ordinary Australians. If we get involved in a war with China, it's going to impact all of us, and significantly. So we're talking about an entirely different scenario. So, and this is the problem we face, is that so much of the decision making for our future, we have outsourced the United States. So if the United States decides to do something, um, we're we're in a pretty awkward situation. And I guess another thing I think about is that you know the BRICS countries, especially the leading nations of that organisation, being China, Russia, and India, I think they're playing the decline of the United States. They're not taking the bait to overreact to anything. And I
You
think
can
they're
see this with India, especially at the moment. The way it's been incredible. It's been one step forward, two steps back. And, Modi's somewhat of an incompetent leader, in my opinion, but they're still managing to be able to hold against a much more incompetent White House there, right?
Yeah. So, which it's probably make a lot of people in Australia choke on their cornflakes, but the best hope I think we have is actually China, Russia, and India, and the other, Asian nations, the other BRICS nations, the SCO nations, actually managing the decline of the United States and its empire.
And potentially we can get in the slipstream by proximity of that, right?
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? We're in a perfect location. Unlike, we're not in Europe, we're not in the Middle East, we're in Asia, and Asia's heading in a direction which we could, jump aboard, make a lot of money, and sort out real problems we have in our economy and society, as opposed to the artificial ones we create through our alliance. So we are in a good situation, but the long and short of it is, I think we've basically outsourced our ability to manage this to third parties, which maybe over time, if another couple of years of the US sort of its unraveling, accelerating, maybe we'll start to see a movement in Australia to actually do something about it, as opposed to just a few lone voices in the wilderness trying to stamp their feet and saying we should be going in a different direction. But we're not there yet in our political class to sort of make that leap.
Yeah, I wonder how much of the gut feeling is there though in the political class now, and how much they're just talking at the memo. Because it does feel under the surface there is a bit of a bubbling kind of nervousness. You're seeing it in Miles, who's the benchmark, who's the canary in the AUKUS coal mine there, and things are slipping inevitably to a point where, as you said, just sitting around and watching our enemies making a mistake seems to be enough here. But it's just a shame that we have to be donked in the head by like a cudgel of rationality, by every single one of our neighbors and a couple of continents, just to sort of go, hey guys, come to the party. Oh yeah. It is sad, and I've written about this many times. In the game of musical chairs at the moment, with Washington's playing the music, we seem to be the last ones wanting to sit down every single time, and we seem to be the last ones standing without a chair at the end of the bloody day. And it's a joke when we're seeing other countries with more chaotic governments than ours, kind of dealing with America much more pragmatically and much more effectively.
But I read our foreign minister, our prime minister, and Miles's defence minister's tweets, and I tend to read more their tweets than listen to them, because that's painful. But to me, it seems largely performative. There doesn't seem to be any, especially Senator Wong. When I read her stuff, it just feels like to me she's going through the motions. And it's quite interesting how often they get ratioed on their on their tweets, as far as the inane comments and Australia stands with, or whatever. And that'll be my next point is, if we had a bold leader who set a vision for Australia in the multipolar world, and yes, they're going to cop criticism from the normal types, but I would think that would be quite popular. It's not a hard argument to craft, and we just don't have the enthusiasm or the inspirational leadership anywhere on display to actually to follow that.
That might be a good time to take us on to essentially US ambitions now and Australia's role within those ambitions. You've written a great piece titled the Crusade Against Multipolarity. And, where you're essentially putting forth the argument that the US now is primarily motivated with disrupting the rise of multipolarism, targeting groups like BRICS, for example, or the SEO, to try and mitigate the rise of multipolarism. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, where is Australia's place in multipolarism? How is it perceived by our political leaders? And where do you think the US sees Australia in its goal to disrupt multipolarism?
So we had the unipolar moment. That was the US domination from the end of or the collapse of the Soviet Union through to, I don't know, somewhere in the mid tens, I think 2014, 15. Or that's when somewhere in around that, we can argue about an exact date, but I think that was sort of the unipolar moment. And now we're having a number of poles of power. So that's what multipolarity is. So we have China, obviously, we have Russia, we have India, we have ASEAN, we have Europe, although how much geopolitical power and economic power Europe has and will have in the future is up for debate. And of course, we have the United States. Now, I don't see any particular problem with a multipolar world. I think it's actually a good thing because it forces people to negotiate and use that D word, diplomacy, as in and actually negotiate and work through issues as opposed to just might is right. Um, and and I guess as the if you look historically too, where has the bulk of economic power been for most of recorded human history? India and China. It's only probably in the last 300-400 years where the Western powers have been economically dominant. And so we're sort of seeing a bit of a reversion to the historical mean in the Eastern world, the global South, the BRICS countries, or however we want to define it. Um, they are currently and will increasingly be most important economically in the world. I think in 2018, by purchasing power parity, when the BRICS economies became bigger than the G7, and that gap is just getting bigger. And I can't see any way it's not going to increase over time because it's just the way things are heading. And of course, that's an affront to the Western world. So it's not just the crusade against multipolarity is not just the United States. It's basically the collective West. So it's the United States. The UK is a key troublemaker in all of this, who still hasn't given up its imperial delusions. Europe and also Australia, and I think even New Zealand with the current government, they're all on board with this sort of crusade that we're seeing. So and why I came up, I'm constantly reading, thinking, listening, and trying to picture and model in my own head, understand what's going on. And I read, listen a lot, and I think most people probably don't do that. So it's like trying to come up with a concept to describe how people can look at the genocide in Gaza, look at what's happening in Ukraine, look at all the tensions with China, look at the shooting match at Iran, and try and tie that all in and try and understand what's going on. So that's why I was thinking of terms, and I came up with crusade because it's got the historical linkages to Christendom in what is it, 12th, 13th centuries, 14th centuries, whenever it was, and those crusades, but also from the perspective that no matter how big the failure, um, the Western powers aren't putting the brakes on. If anything, they're doubling down. So it's like there's a religiosity to it. Like there's it's not pragmatic. It's not based on reality. It's based on a worldview where we must dominate, and we're going to continue to um, crusade against the multipolar world until either we have a global conflagration or domestic political circumstances mean that the Western world or the segments of it go in different directions. And I think there's also within that grouping, it's not a coherent grouping. So we have the US. Even within the US, it's not coherent. Like there's those the true believers, the US exceptionalism. There's the business lobby who the corporate powers who are also trying to re-establish US corporate dominance in certain sectors. Whereas I think the European, and I mean the war in Ukraine is critical to this, because my take on what happened is that I don't think Europe wanted the war. Well, most of Europe didn't want the war in Ukraine to occur. And that was all the negotiations, if you remember, before the special military operation started, about sanctions and what would happen. Like that was the United States, probably the UK, and some of the other EU nations trying to get do their work behind the scenes to get all the European nations on board. And I think they thought that when if they got to the circumstances where Russia invaded, the ruble would be rubble. They'd weaken Russia. They'd overthrow Putin. There'd be a compliant leader put in place. Best case, the Russian Federation would be split up into multiple smaller countries which are less powerful, and which you put a client regime in, and then you can extract all their minerals and energy and food, and that greatly beneficial for Europe, because Europe's in big trouble, because they've lost their empire, like we're seeing what's happening in Africa with France and that, and they've lost their access to cheap uranium, and there's these things happening. So Europe's in big trouble because it doesn't have a lot of resources itself. So I think they signed up thinking that this is an opportunity for Europe to actually benefit from the breakup of Russia, but that failed. And now we're in a circumstance where no one's willing to acknowledge the failure. I mean, this is what all the theatre we see with Trump, and we're going to sell weapons to the Europeans, and they're going to give them to Ukraine, and where US has washed their hands of that to try to provide that separation, although everyone knows that NATO is the US. So there's different motivating factors, and then you've got the British, who the elite in Britain never gave up on the British Empire, so that's playing a role in it. And Australia, as a colonial settler colony, always been part of an empire first, the British, and that I guess it's in our culture that we're part of this. So there's some of the forces working against multipolarity.
This feels like a very Anglo-spheric weighted project. There's so much of a sun doesn't set on the British Empire aspect to all of this. Even the way Washington is seeing its primacy in the world. And if we can't have it, no one can, which was also a thing that sort of happened when Britain ruled the waves, where they were able to crush opponents through their massive maritime power and things like that. But it feels like the further reality sort of slips from the grasp of these very ideological decision makers in the Anglosphere, the more they're hearkening back to these kind of old muscle memories and these triumphs. It's incredible to think that the Ukrainian war is motivated by some crazy ideology from the Great Game in the 1850s, that's still this animosity towards Peter the Great and things like that carry on throughout this British elite mindset and dominates the thinking. And even the way they're holding on to empire in this Anglo-spheric mindset, as opposed to what you mentioned, say the French in Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso and things like that. They're letting go, or not letting go, but they're dealing with their loss of empire in a much more honest way, I have to say, compared to this collective madness in the Anglosphere about what their empire is and how important it is to hold on to it. Is there something to that a little bit?
100% there's something to it. And I think racism is part of it.
Yeah.
Superiority is part of it. And it's it's a maladaptive way of dealing with your own decline. I mean, it's not pleasant or an easy thing to deal with when you've been top dog for a period of time, and then you're no longer top dog. But that's, I mean, that's history. I mean, and it's in animal kingdom, it's in human societies, it's in civilizations and empires. So I guess you either deal with it, and make the most of it. And this is the thing, like, the 21st century. Surely we are sophisticated enough and have learned enough from our history that we're not going to destroy ourselves trying to maintain an empire. Particularly when the multipolar, the countries driving multipolarity, what do they want? They want security, and they want to trade.
That's right.
They want to make money, make the economic development for their people, many of whom have suffered from colonialism and imperialism, and so are well behind where we in the West are as far as living standards. And I guess it's a totally different mentality. Like, it's the zero sum game mentality. Is that if we're not dominating, other powers will do what we've done, which is just a case of projection. And I mean, like, referring to, I guess, China, there. But, like, where in the several thousand years of Chinese history is there in Confucian culture, and that is there that drive to dominate the entire world? Like, I think when people talk about that, it's largely a projection of how we would deal with, if we were in China's situation. This is how we would do it, and I think that drives a lot of the angst towards China in particular.
China's looking to embrace the world through the One Belt Road, through the SEO, through the Asia Bank. But we're looking at America now challenging this multipolarism, and all the like multilateral efforts that are being put in to sort of secure this burgeoning new world order. But we're seeing with, say, America, what's happening with India and China with trade disputes. And then we're seeing like these hasty decisions being made in the Middle East. I just heard they guaranteed Qatar's security overnight, like an Article 5 style guarantee. But this is contrasting against, say, the Saudis and the Pakistanis making a security deal. Things seem to be slipping really quick. And we even heard about them talking about reclaiming Bagram. So to what extent now is US decision making being motivated by combating multipolarity?
Well, I mean, I think there's method to Trump's madness, as far as, he throws out one idea, then backflips, and I wouldn't say 180. I think, like, it's, you might turn around 170 degrees and then he's bouncing off 150 degrees. So I think there's method to the madness, but I think it comes back to that recognition, whether it's explicit or implicit, that they're in trouble and that they're trying to find a way out. And, unfortunately for an empire, you got to pay your dues. Like, they're in such deep financial trouble. Like, their economy, like, you look at the fundamental inputs into their economy, like educated workforce, a stable society. They've got, they're at war within themselves. So, like, let's just assume he's not evil and he's actually trying to do the right thing by America. But they're out of options and they're trying to do everything other than what they need to do. And I mean, to give up on empire, I mean, the US is still going to be a powerful country. Like, it's a big country, it's got resources, large population, relatively well-educated population, although you can argue about the state of that, has declined over time. So it's still got all the foundational aspects for a powerful country for centuries to come, if it doesn't destroy itself in the process. But and I think also there's so many. There's a guy, John Michael Greer, who I've read for a long time, and he talked about, like, this might be 10 or 15 years ago, but there's so many power factions in the US, and none of them have enough power to actually send the country in a certain direction, but they've got veto power. So I think that's part of it as well. So you've got all the different factions, and if they go too far down one way, then this faction on. So it's it's civil war is probably not the right term, but it's that internal conflict trying to how do we manage our decline? And I mean, Trump's obviously not the right person for that. And I guess this is why I think empires tend to collapse, because they probably all end up in the same circumstance where there's lots of little factions with enough power to stop something happening, but not enough to fix the problems. And because they never fix the problems, they end up imploding. So I think that's probably the likely fate of the United States. It'll have some sort of internal implosion because it's just incapable of actually addressing its issues, which is a damn shame, because if they had taken a different approach at the end of the Cold War, and disbanded NATO, and rather than trying to dominate the world, work with the world, yes, they might have had some decline because other countries would have inevitably risen and been in power. But the United States has the fundamental what it needs to be a powerful country, but rather than just accept that and work with the world for the benefit of its population, it went on this sort of mad spree over 30 years to try and cement dominance, and it's having the opposite effect.
Because that like Fukuyama on the brain is a hard thing to shake, I suppose. And, and I wonder if that end of history moment really stained the brains of the foreign policy class in Washington. It's very hard to sort of shake something that out of your head. It's a new concept, this kind of Pax Americana on steroids. And as we're seeing this sort of empire fail, I wonder if they're coming late to the table. Like, they could have been first to the table as a fighting fit multipolar world leader, that was leading in all the metrics and could have dictated terms within that environment from day one and been the main contributor to it. And it could have maintained primacy for maybe half a century on top of that.
And that's the tragedy. Mearsheimer talks about it. That is the tragedy. The United States could have remained the most powerful country in the world for a long time, even though its relative power was not as great, if it had have just played its cards right. And I mean, it could have been a beneficial force for for addressing the problems in the world, many of the problems we have. But it took a path of that unipolar went to the leadership classes, the oligarchic classes head, and we see what's resulted, and that's how we've ended up where we are. And I mean, I think you look at countries like China, Russia, India, and even some of the middle powers, Iran, Turkey, etc. I mean, I think they probably know the United States better than what the United States does.
Totally.
And so they're I'm 100% certain that neither Russia nor China wants to take over as the global hegemon, because their own experiences and observations, and being I think quite rational societies, see that always ends up ending badly for the hegemon. And that's that comes back to that managing the decline of the United States. So I mean, you just imagine if if roles were reversed and China was acting towards the United States the way that the United States does towards China, or the same situation with Russia, and we would have already had World War III. Like, we'd probably all be dead by now, because there's no way the United States would have accepted that.
There would have been no Cuban Missile Crisis moment in this day and age.
That's right. Yeah. So but so that's that managing decline by they're absorbing what they can and then reacting where they have to. Which is like the war that explains the war in Ukraine. And I mean, you look at the tariffs, how the countries, just China just said nothing, and all this bluster and that, and
now they're building 7 NM chips and transforming the globe.
Yeah, they're just getting on busy creating an actual reality, as opposed to the reality that we see on Twitter or the TV screen, or all the media that we're subjected to.
Trump is stepping into the empire position in ways that previous leaders haven't and may have wanted to. But essentially, I like to think that, there's some of those like Pax Americana folk in Washington that have been thinking, oh, well, the way we can do this is like, we're the Republic right now, and we can have a Julius Caesar moment, and we can cross the Rubicon. Yeah, we're going to piss off everyone. But then after that, we're going to put in Augustus, and we might get a Diocletian, and we might get a Hadrian and a Trajan, and we're going to set up shop for another century or something. And, but they've skipped straight to a Caligula. and and they've hyper accelerated their demise in the process, because the one thing holding them together was this incredible Jeffersonian mythology of this like American society that being hung, drawn, and quartered by Trump right now in the streets of key cities. So as a middle power that's standing back and watching essentially what's emerging like as a disruptive power. America's navy isn't there to police the Straits of Hormuz and ensure, supply chains are open on the seas. Its navy is to just shoot boats out of the water off the coast of Venezuela now. So we are going to see a disruptive superpower on this earth, flexing its muscle and using its military to affect outcomes in regions that it's not happy. Where does it leave Australia, who needs this international system? Penny Wong, for all her auto comments, has said more than anything that we rely on international law and the international system so we can have a fair suck of the sauce bottle, in the world. So where does that leave Australia? When our big partner is starting to look like Tony Montana more so than a nation state?
Well, I think, within Australia, I guess we have the security apparatus and class who are, generally, very much invested in US empire. But we also have the business class who, know where the money's to be made, and that's primarily through trade with China and that. So I guess, I get the feeling dollars talk at the end of the day, and as the US becomes increasingly unstable. I mean, it's just quite interesting though how and concerning in the media when the United States does outlandish things and they get reported, or some of it gets reported, but not in a I always apply that if China did this or if Russia did this, how it would be reported, but it's just reported matter of factly. But I think our I think there'll be the internal tension, and let's hope that the business class wins out, because if we trade, develop. That's the path to prosperity. Whereas getting into conflicts, certain elements of our society tend to benefit, but as a population as a whole doesn't. So I guess the more, and this is where we should be doing a lot more as far as cultural ties, diplomacy, all those sorts of actions which actually help us to get over some of the stumbling blocks that we have. So, for example, I went to at my university, they had the Chinese consulate general, and also had some from a couple of universities in China. We had an agriculture forum where we had an exchange and that, and there's really big opportunities, because Australia has a lot of the same troubles that China does when it comes to food security and things like that. So they're different but similar in a lot of ways. And the consul general just put it, there's there's five ways that we're sort of natural partners, China and Australia. So we're in the same region, so we're maybe not neighbours, but we're certainly from a global perspective quite close. We're complementary economies. Obviously, we provide a lot, and when they produce and turn that into something which we tend to buy back, but we're not actually competitors. We're complementary. When we talk, when we have dialogue, as opposed to lecturing and accusatory claims against one country. And I guess he did it quite well, the consul general, talking about a question was asked about one of the participants talked about the elephant in the room being the treatment of Uyghurs and minorities, and he put it quite well. He said, "Well, have you been there? And you're welcome to visit." Oh, sorry, the person hadn't, of course. He said, "You're welcome to visit," but then he sort of reflected it back on Australia and the problems we have with how we treat First Nations people. So rather than lecturing China, we should be dialogue as to how we address issues. And he put it very well, how the Chinese approach is economic development by lifting people out of poverty. That's how we deal with the issues that we have. And then engagement was the last one, and that's that multi-leveled engagement. So whether it's individuals going traveling two-way, I'm talking about China, but this is our whole region. Indonesia, we need to know Indonesia a whole lot better than what we do. Have more people speak the language, make it easier for Indonesians to come to Australia and vice versa, with visa arrangements, etc. But what quite surprised me, we had a Queensland government minister at this forum, and he put the final, after speaking after the consul general, spoke about friendship between the two countries. And this is the thing that gets me is I don't, Australia has no natural enemies other than what we create through, namely our alliance and our hang-ups with our imperial past. But, and I mean, it'd put ASPI out of business if we were actually friendly with China, because what would they have to write about? But, why can't we just be friends with these countries as opposed to have to put up this artificial, and very dangerous, very counterproductive, very unnecessary tension and provocations and, you know, it's unnecessary. Let's just be friends. I see no reason why we can't be friends with any of the countries in our region because we have no natural enemies. So why are we going down the path where, this is our policy of deterrence? I think is going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We can't afford. If China wanted to invade us, what are we going to do to stop it? Like, we could fire a few torpedoes of our, one submarine that's probably available, or whatever. We couldn't, but they have no intention to. And there's no likelihood of that occurring other than through, for example, hosting US military bases. So I think circling back to that. So let's just forget about all that. We're fortunate that a country like China actually wants to be friendly with all countries. So that should be our objective, to be friendly, establish relations, forget all this silly geopolitical nonsense that we're going about. I mean, we need to be careful and don't get taken advantage of, but, that's why you have diplomats for. You make deals and you put your case forward, and there's no reason we can't get along well. And I think that's where we need to be heading, because this sort of belligerent, you everything to do with maintaining the empire, having the US bases on our country, talking about the most difficult strategic circumstance we've faced since the Second World War. Well, it's all artificial because we've created it. So let's just cut that nonsense out and focus on building the bridges that we need to, whether it's with any of the countries in our region, including China, so that we can actually, when we have issues, we're in a space where we can actually resolve them through diplomacy and dialogue, as opposed to threatening and belligerent behaviour.
It's a great way of putting it, Cameron, and perhaps a good place to leave it. Australia does need to do, it just needs to reach back into the bag, really. There was a period potentially, I'd say maybe in the 90s for a little bit there. I call it the Kieran Perkins Aussie gold era, where, we were sort of shooting above our, above our weight a little bit and having a crack at everything. And we were making an impact on the world stage. We had these blokes like Gareth Evans being internationally respected, and Australia having clout in the region. Once upon a time, there were European trade delegations that would come over here before they went to China to have a bit of a chat about how things are done. And now we're kind of, I think we're left languishing a little bit. And it really, leadership requires that imagination, and we've lacked it. We live in such a dynamic and vibrant region, and we're at such a tectonic change from unipolar to multipolarity. And at the very least, I think we need some imagination and creativity in our leadership to be able to muster the courage to think of something uniquely beautiful that could work for this country. And it's something that you and I have been talking shit about for a long time now.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's not a hard vision to sell. And I mean, we just have to get over ourselves a little bit. We've got a few hang-ups with our past, and which I think that's our biggest threat, actually, is our hang-up with our colonial past. We haven't come to terms with how Australia was settled with Europeans. We haven't come to terms with our multicultural society that we live in. And that, without dealing with that, I don't think we can engage within our region. So we got a lot of work to do. But if we look big picture and just set that vision about how Australia can benefit mightily from the region we live in and the direction it's heading, and then actually we can focus on the real issues that we face in this country, not the sort of artificial ones which create a lot of fear and give people something people to write about every time China farts or something. They can write an article about the threat that China poses. Like we get rid of all that silliness and focus on addressing real issues. And as a soil scientist, I'm far more concerned about the condition of our land than I am about what China may or may not do to this country.
Totally. And like our proud scientific tradition is also something that's gone languishing as we've outsourced, as you say, we've outsourced so much. And, just to close it here, I was speaking to Wendy Bacon about the effects of neoliberalism on journalists. And we can look at the effects of neoliberalism on many things. But right now, I think in this sort of stale, stagnant decision making, you can really see the impacts of neoliberalism on our sovereign agency and how our decision makers getting warm, cozy spots chasing politics at all costs have outsourced everything, including our sovereign future, to a dying empire. And it's kind of disgraceful, really.
I was at not my uni, but a different university yesterday, and I was just listening to a conversation as I was having lunch, and the stress that our that economic model is putting our academics under, for example, totally counterproductive. Like there's a person who was basically in tears under the pressure they had, because they're not bringing enough money in, and like it's just it's counterproductive. And that's, I guess, it's one of those other core issues we need to fix is our economic model. Who does it benefit? What's the purpose of it? Is it to benefit all Australians, or is it to benefit a small minority who, the oligarchic class? And that's another probably a discussion for another day.
It's another episode. Cameron, thank you so much for coming again. And always appreciating having your subject matter expertise. And you're one of the the people thinking full time about our sovereign future. And it's great to have your insight.
No worries. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, Joel.
Cheers, mate. Talk soon.
Cheers.